Hey everybody, it's Lon.TV, and we're taking a look today at some new retro-inspired game controllers from 8bitdo. This is their new SN30 Pro. They have another one also called the SF30 Pro. The only big difference here are the buttons, and I'll talk about the differences here in a second. And this, of course, looks just like a Super Nintendo controller. It feels a lot like one too, but they added a few extra things into the mix here, like some analog sticks. It also has rumble built in, some extra trigger buttons at the top, and motion controls that work with the Nintendo Switch and other platforms as well. A pretty complete package here. And we're going to be putting these things through their paces in just a second. But I do want to let you know, in the interest of full disclosure, these came in free of charge from 8bitdo. However, all the opinions you're about to hear are my own. Nobody is paying for this review, and no one has reviewed this content before I uploaded it. So let's get to work here and see what these things are all about. So let's take a closer look now at the hardware. These will operate wirelessly or wired. There's a USB Type-C port here at the top. They give you a USB-C to USB-A cable in the box, so you can plug it into just about any USB port out there. And of course, it's got a Bluetooth radio built in for its wireless capabilities. And these are selling for $50 right now on Amazon. You get the controller in the box along with a charging cable for it. There's an internal battery built in. They also have an optional bracket for about another $8 or so for attaching your mobile phone. Now, this is the one modeled after the Super Nintendo that we got here in the United States. So what will happen here is you'll have your B and A buttons that are rounded, and then you've got these concave buttons here for X and Y. If you ever held a Super Nintendo controller, this is going to feel pretty much the same. It really has the same overall feel, nice high-quality plastic on it, very well constructed. Now, the SF30 here is identical in its overall hardware, but it has a slightly darker color to it to model it after the Super Famicom version, and all of the buttons here are rounded and have different colors, but otherwise they are performing the same, at least in my testing. The analog sticks here are pretty nice. They don't have a lot of distance to them. They are very, very sensitive too, so they will take some getting used to, but you have to do very, very fine movements here to get those fine movements on screen. So they are not as wide a range perhaps as what you might get with a Pro controller on the Switch or one of the PlayStation or Xbox controllers. Not a lot of distance here to the stick, and again, very sensitive, but I think you can get used to that. On the top, you do have additional trigger buttons that you don't usually have on a controller like this. So you've got traditional shoulder buttons here and then two triggers. But these are not analog triggers. They're either on or off, so there's no range to the button press here. So if you've got games that depend on analog triggers, you're not going to have them on this controller. The D-pad feels very nice, very close to the original Super Nintendo D-pad that you might have experienced back in the day. It feels very similar to their other Super Nintendo-inspired controller that we've looked at here in the past, so that seems to be working well. Select and start buttons are in the same place you remember them being. This star button down here is something you can pair up with a button to make it go into turbo mode. So you can assign turbo mode to any of the buttons on the controller, and you can also use this to turn it off if you don't want that anymore. And over here is a home button, so if you're in applications on Android, for example, that support it, you can hit this to go home on your device. They also have the ability to mount a smartphone to it. They have an optional clip here that you can get. It attaches to the bottom of the device here. There's a little latching point there. Whoops, and a little bit hard to get on, as you can see. I'll put it on here towards the end of the video so you can see how it works with a smartphone, but you can attach your Android phone up to it and use it that way. One thing to note, though, is that this will not work with the iPhone. It will work with the Mac, but not with the iPhone. And there's actually a good amount of support for this controller. So it will work with the Mac, as I mentioned. It works in Windows, both in direct input as well as X input, so it can simulate an Xbox controller, for example, for games that support that. You have to put it into that mode. You just hit X and start to put it into the Bluetooth mode for X input, but all of my Windows computers detected it automatically as we went into it. And if you hit Y and start, you can pair it up with your Nintendo Switch, which of course we'll be taking a look at in a second as well. So lots of compatibility. It's also going to work with their retro receivers, which are these little receivers that they have for the Super Nintendo, the original NES as well. They plug right into the controller ports on those retro consoles and allow you to play your games wirelessly with a controller that feels a lot like the original. Those things work great. I've reviewed them in the past. these will work with it. At the time that I'm recording this, though, this is a pre-release version. They weren't yet working with those devices, but there will be a firmware update to bring support for that. They'll also work with the receivers they've made for the NES Classic as well as the SNES Classic device, so you can pair these up with Nintendo's new retro consoles as well. So let's take a look at how these things work. We're first going to load up Windows here and try out a game on that. We'll look at the Switch after that, and then we'll take a look at an Android phone. All right, so let's take a look at the PC first, and I've got my controller connected up via Bluetooth to my PC. This is a Windows 10 PC, and I have it operating as Xinput without any drivers required. I think you do need Windows 10 for this to work. Now, the one thing with these controllers is that these sticks are very sensitive. So as I mentioned, it's really hard to get very fine movements here. So you really have to give very slight movements if you want to get a slow camera pan like this. Usually they react pretty quickly to any movement there, but generally they seem to be working pretty nice, and it's a nice compact controller too compared to maybe one of the larger Xbox or PS4 controllers you might normally pair up. The one issue I'm running into these controllers with, though, is how loud the vibration motor is in them. Listen to this. So it's got a very audible noise to its vibration motor, so when your controller is rumbling, you're going to not only feel it, but hear this little motor running on the controller. I thought maybe it was just this one, maybe there was a defect with it, but the other one that I have here is also making the same noise. So be prepared for a little bit of a noisy experience with that rumble. If it is bothering you, you might want to turn that off. But by and large, all the buttons are mapped correctly. I have found, though, of course, that the way the Xinput standard labels the buttons might be different than what you see here on the controller. So the position will be correct, but the actual button label will be a little different because, again, these are sticking to the original Super Nintendo labeling versus what Microsoft might be doing for Xinput. Now, if you're a fan of the Nintendo Switch, as I am, the good news is that this controller works with the Switch, and you get full functionality here of the sticks. As you can see, you also get a nice home button here, so you can jump back to your menu when you want to do that. But the cool thing is, if I go into my camera mode here, is that you get full motion controls as well. It looks like they've got a gyroscope in the controller here, so you can largely replicate the experience you might get with the more expensive Switch Pro controller, yet have something that is sized more appropriately for retro gaming with that D-pad front and center on there. So I'm really quite pleased with how this works, and again, being able to do all the motion controls here is really great. So all in a very good Switch experience, with the exception of the fact that every time that vibration motor fires off, you're going to be hearing it and feeling it, unfortunately. Ooh, look, I found a star. So pretty good stuff here, but just know that this controller does not support the HD rumble. So if you have a game that requires that feature, you're not going to get it on this controller, but everything else seems to work pretty nicely, even though you're going to be hearing it vibrating quite a bit. So let's move on now to Android phone support, and I've got my phone booted up here. We're going to attach that clip that I sent flying across the room a little bit earlier. It is a little tricky to get this clip attached, but once you get it in there, it really holds itself together. It is like latched onto this thing pretty furiously. So you have this bracket that attaches here, and then you've got this second piece here that also gets put together here. It's a little bit difficult to take it on and off easily, but once it's on, it's pretty well inserted there, as you can see. It has a lot of room here to make adjustments, so you should be able to fit a larger phone in here. I do have a smaller Galaxy S8 at the moment, and once it's in there, of course, it feels a little top heavy because the phone's weight will be adding to the mix there. Now, you do need to get the controller switched into Bluetooth mode, so you hold down B and start to do that. I did notice that the bracket was covering up the pairing button, but I was able to pair the controller up with my phone anyhow, so that was a good thing. And by and large, it does seem to work pretty nicely here as a little portable gaming device. You can attach your phone very securely. It comes out very easily here, so the bracket is decent enough to hold your phone in place, but also easy enough to get out of there. I did have to put this phone in a little off-center just because it was covering up some of the buttons, and it was pushing those buttons as I was inserting the phone, but otherwise it's been working pretty nicely here and not too bad of an experience. So let's move on now to some latency testing. In other words, how long does it take for a button push on the controller to register on screen? And we've got a couple of different platforms to look at here, so we're going to start off with the PC. Now, what I do in these tests is I shoot the screen with my iPhone at 240 frames per second. I play the video back and count how many frames it takes for the button push to result in an action being taken on screen. And I like to use on the PC an application called Game Controller Tester. And on the PC, we got a score of 104 milliseconds when we were using a hardwired USB connection back to the computer in Xinput mode. That compares to 44 milliseconds on that same computer with that same application running with an Xbox One controller. So you will see slightly less performance out of this than you might see out of a native Xbox controller hooked up to your PC via USB. So just bear that in mind. The Bluetooth performance was about the same, actually. So perhaps there's some software inside the controller that hasn't yet been optimized, and they do offer frequent firmware updates on this. And on the Nintendo Switch, measuring on its internal display, we got the same exact latency, 104 milliseconds connecting up via Bluetooth. Compare that to 64 milliseconds with the Nintendo Pro controller. Now, what interested me about that result is that a couple of weeks ago, we looked at connecting up the regular SNES controller that 8bitdo makes with the Switch, and that controller came in at the exact same score as the Pro controller. That's why I think there's probably some firmware that might get updated as this product develops to maybe give it some better optimization. So I'm going to probably revisit this after a few firmware updates get pushed down, because I know their other controller does better than this one does at the moment insofar as latency is concerned. So it's a little on the higher end of the scale for latency at the moment. And again, we'll do a follow-up if things do improve later. And Android latency came in around 116 milliseconds via Bluetooth connected to a Galaxy S8 from Samsung. Not a bad score, actually, for what I've usually been seeing out of these Android devices, but every phone is going to be a little different based on how quickly it gets video data to the display. So your mileage may vary on that, but I was pleased to see there wasn't much of an overhead, at least on the S8 with this controller. So that's going to do it for these new 8bitdo controllers. I really like the way these feel in my hand. They feel very familiar, yet I get all of the controls that I might need to play some of my more modern games, including the modern games that I might want to play on my Nintendo Switch as well. So great compatibility here. Not perfect, though, as we saw. The big issues that I see at the moment are the loudness of that vibration motor. It's audibly loud, and it really kind of distracted me a bit from my gameplay, so that I was not crazy about at all. And the latency can be better, and I think it will get better as they come up with some additional firmware for the controllers. I think the latency is fixable, not so much on the vibration motor. So we'll definitely be coming back to these things, and we'll see if maybe they make some improvements to that vibration motor in future product iterations. But just know that going into this, if you like the form factor, you might want to turn that motor off because it is quite loud and quite distracting. This is Lon.TV. Thanks for watching.
This channel is brought to you by my Patreon supporters, including gold level supporters, the Black Eyed and Blues Music Hour podcast, Chris Allegretta, and Kalyan Kumar. If you want to help the channel, you can by contributing as little as $1 a month. Head over to Lon.TV/Patreon to learn more. And don't forget to subscribe. Visit Lon.TV/S.